Okay, I want to do a nice little review video about the k-value because the k-value is difficult. I know people always have troubles with it, so hopefully this helps to sort out some of your confusion. Okay, so at the top here I have written the general formula for the quadratic function with all the possible transformations applied to it. Okay, and one little trick I want to remind you guys of right off the start is if you guys are wondering, what transformations affect the graph vertically and which transformations affect the graph horizontally, a neat little trick for remembering this is the transformations outside of the brackets, so the Q and the A, always affect the graph vertically. Okay, so the transformations on the outside of the brackets affect the graph vertically. And that makes sense because we know that A is a vertical stretch or compression. And we know that Q is a vertical shift up or down. So the two outside transformations affect the graph vertically. Okay, and on the other hand, the two transformations that are inside, so the K and the P value, affect the graph horizontally. And we know that to be true because the K value is a horizontal stretch or compression, and the P value is a horizontal shift left or right. So to summarize again, transformations that are inside of those brackets, so the K and the P, they affect the graph horizontally, horizontal stretch or compression or horizontal shift. The transformations on the outside of the brackets, so the A and the Q value, affect the graph vertically because A is a vertical stretch or compression and Q is a vertical shift up or down. Okay, let's now look at our K value. So we know our K value is a horizontal stretch or compression. And I know some of you guys get confused when you see a number in a function, like the 2 or the half. Sometimes it's tough to figure out, is that a horizontal stretch or is that a horizontal compression? Okay, and I'm going to go into kind of how to understand which is which. So let's look at this first example here. Okay, so let's quickly write down the base graph for a quadratic function. Okay, so if we wanted to apply this value to our function, and don't worry yet if it's a stretch or a compression, okay? Let's just learn how to use our K value first, because that'll make understanding the difference easier. So we want to apply a K value of 2 to our base graph. How do we do that? Well, I want you guys to look at the back side of the first page of Unit 2, Lesson 5. There's a list of 6 steps. Okay, so pause the video and find that. Okay, so on that list of 6 steps, I want you guys to look at number 4B. Okay, there's a really important point that I want you guys to memorize, highlight, okay, write it at the top of your test the second you get your test. And the statement that is important is where it says dividing the x values by k. Okay, and this statement is really important because it tells you how to apply a k value. So we already know k value here is 2. To apply it, we need to divide the x values by k. Okay, that is very important. So to apply a k value of 2, what are we going to do? We're going to take all the x values in our table and divide them by 2. So negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. This guy divided by 2 is negative 1/2, 1/2, and 1. Okay, y values stay the same. And then you go ahead and graph this. Okay, so we just applied our k value. That is how you apply your k value. But that still doesn't answer the question. How do you look at your k-value and know, right, if you had to, write your list of transformations, how do you know if you would say that is a horizontal stretch of 2 or a horizontal compression of 2? Okay. Here's how you do that. So look at what we did between our two tables of values. To apply the k-value, we divided all the x values by 2. So if you're dividing something by 2, you're compressing it. So this would be a horizontal compression. Okay, so we know it's a horizontal compression. Now we need to say a horizontal compression by something. Okay, so if you look on page 58 of your textbook, in the green in summary box, the last 3 bullet points are very important and they will help you with that. Okay, so we know how to differentiate between a horizontal compression or a horizontal stretch, but now we're figuring out how to write what that stretch or compression is by. So it says right there, it's always by a factor of 1 over k. Okay, so what was our k value? Our k value was 2, so we just plug in 2 for k. So for this question, you would say it's a horizontal compression by a half. Okay, let's try number 2. So our k value is a half. Let's start with our base graph. So if we want to apply that k value to our graph, how do we do that? Well, look at this statement we wrote down before. You always divide the x values by the k value. So we're going to divide all of our x values by a half. But when you divide any number by a half, you're actually multiplying by the reciprocal. For example, let's say we wanted to take this x value and divide it by half. How would you do that? Well, you'd go 2 times the reciprocal of this, which is just 2 times 2, which is 4. So dividing your x values by a fraction or dividing your x values by a half is the same as multiplying your x values by 2. Okay, so I'm going to multiply all my x values by 2. And my y values stay the same. Okay, so I just applied our k value using this statement here. Very important. Now I need to state my sentence at the end. Was that a horizontal stretch or a horizontal compression? Okay, we know it's a horizontal stretch because we were multiplying our x values by 2. So when you multiply something by a number, it gets bigger, so it's a stretch. Now to figure out what that stretch was by, it's always by 1 over k. So let's plug in our k value of a half. And when we simplify that, it turns into 2. So this question was a horizontal stretch by 2. Okay, so that's all the reasoning behind it, and hopefully that helps you understand. If you want to think of a shortcut trick, just think of it this way. When it's a whole number, it's always going to be a compression. When it's a fraction, it's always going to be a stretch. And then when you're figuring out the number that the horizontal stretch or compression is by, remember this formula, 1 over k. Just plug your k value into that denominator, simplify it, and then you get your value. And just as a reminder, remember everything I've taught in this video only applies to your k value. Okay, it does not apply to your A values. So everything I taught in this video only use when you're dealing with your K values.